Welcome back to Let's Read Darksiders, the Abomination Vault. I'm BurningDogFace, and I am kind of surprised to be saying those words, given that the first two videos were an April Fool's Day joke, but I actually received some pretty positive feedback on those from some people who wanted to hear me do more. Plus, frankly, more importantly, after taking an unplanned week-long hiatus from making videos due to the unfortunate death of my cat Mushu, may he rest in peace, I thought this would be a good way to ease back into making videos. Start with something nice and simple, like a still image while I read someone else's words. That came out a bit more cynical than I intended, but yes, before we begin, I did want to mention that I was kind of playing it by the cuff, or off the cuff last time. That's the phrase. Given that the whole thing was kind of a joke. But going back over the footage, I realized I never said the author's name. And I know you can clearly see it right there on the screen, since I'm showing the front cover image. But if I wrote the book, I would want to be acknowledged. So before we go any further, special ultimate thanks to R.I.P. for creating this story for us. Yes, it has been a while. So we last left off at the end of Chapter 1, where Death had discovered a murdered angel and was using his necromancy to reanimate the body in order to get some answers on what's going on so close to Eden. We now pick up with Chapter 2, and since this might be a little unclear at first, this chapter is written in the first-person perspective, from the perspective of the murdered angel. So here we go. Chapter 2. I do not... Where... Who are you? Oh, Creator, that voice. Everywhere, everywhere. Who are you? I do not understand. I saw the most wondrous colors, heard the most beautiful songs. I was at peace. And you will return shortly. Who are you? My name, I was Sarasael. You know who I am? I do. I know not how I know, but I knew you the moment you called me back, before I knew even myself. You died here. Yes, you were murdered here, cut down by your enemies. I would know who. I would know what happened. And then I might return to my rest? I promise it. Then listen well. I was a soldier of the White City, and served well for centuries uncounted. My place was, and likely would ever be, with the Faneguard. We were a brigade of steadfast, battle-hardened warriors. Our commander was Malahide, personally chosen and elevated to the rank of general by our Lord Abaddon himself. We were a rarity among the legions of the White City, a division tasked with the defense and protection of vital or sacred places, rather than more direct action against the enemies of heaven. A position of smaller glories, perhaps, less likely to raise us high in the esteem of our brethren, but an urgent and necessary undertaking for all that. We did our duty, followed where Malahide ordered, and never once resented our lot. In our day, we guarded military outposts in ancient temples and repositories of knowledge that would make even the archivists of the Charred Council weep with envy. And then, at the dawn of the current age, we were assigned to patrol the borders of Eden. I can sense your surprise. You had no notion that the angels had taken it upon ourselves to defend the garden. But is it truly so startling? We know the Creator's mind. We know his plans for that place, and for the race yet to be born. We certainly could not trust the Charred Council to look after Eden, even if they thought it fell under their purview, and we still do not comprehend their thoughts or motivations well enough to guess whether they would have. Who could they send to defend it? One of you, a horseman? The last of the Nephilim, whose bloody transgressions are the very reason Eden requires protecting at all? No. Unacceptable. So the Faneguard came here, to this empty little world to which Eden is bound. Our long-term presence might technically violate our pact with Hell and the Charred Council, but we've never interfered with the world itself, nor left the isolated area we were meant to guard. A defensive force only, ready to rebuff any effort by any creature or faction to breach the sanctity of the garden, until the coming of the race to be. Our task was simple and our battles few. Mostly we engaged the occasional scavenger, a maker, or one of the other old ones, curious to explore the Promised Land, or to study its nature, or perhaps to forage the remains of your slaughtered brethren. We drove most away with ease, and killed those who proved too intractable for their own good. Again, perhaps not the most exhilarating of assignments, but we understood its importance. I do not believe we grew complacent. I believe that the forces that came upon us so recently, I cannot say precisely when, having lain here dead for some time, simply overmatched us, but I do not suppose we can know for certain. Perhaps we were indeed unwary, careless. They burst from the trees, making for the gateway to Eden, and we almost failed even to spot them. They had come to this world some distance away, taken their time, crept slowly and silently through the underbrush, until they'd drawn near enough to make their charge. They were, too, astonishingly small. 6-limbed, with an almost canine body and a humanoid trunk. But even had they stood upon their hind legs, they'd scarcely have reached my shoulders. Headless, featureless, save for a smattering of unfamiliar rooms scarred into their substance. Stone, these creatures, not flesh. Constructs, clearly intended either to labor or to do battle as the occasion might warrant. Their fingers were long, far too long in proportion. They twisted and writhed, flexing in ways no natural stone should flex, sometimes blending fluidly together before solidifying once more. They could, it appeared, form only the simplest of tools or the simplest of weapons, but their edges were sharp and their blows heavy. You know, better than most, how effectively the simplest weapons can kill. We needed no orders from Malahide. The Faneguard trained and drilled extensively for any contingency, including a sudden influx of earthbound adversaries from the depths of the trees. We each had our assigned positions, and we took them without hesitation. I heard the cannons engage from behind, saw bursts of raw force and blessed flechettes erupt across the forest. Miniature volcanoes they were, or the Creator's lightning. Whole swaths of forest were blasted apart, everything within shredded or incinerated. No simple stone, even mystically vivified as these constructs were, could stand against such a bombardment. The creatures died by the scores, yet they appeared by the hundreds. Someone prepared heavily for this attempted incursion. By the time I and my brethren had closed to do battle, necessitating the silencing of the cannons, there must have been well over 1,000 of them scuttling towards the gate. I dropped through the trees, wings spread only enough to slow my descent. A blizzard of leaves and broken branches swirled out around me, torn from the boughs at the touch of my armor. Barely a moment's thought was sufficient to call the power inherent in my weapon. Lightning and fire flickered across the blade in intertwined arcs. The earth shook beneath the impact of an entire phalanx of the White City's soldiers. The first of the constructs was directly below, and I cleaved it with the glaive even as I landed. It burst apart, unable to stand against the sacred steel, let alone the powerful energies that danced over it. Several bits of stone shrapnel ricocheted from my armor, and I recall a brief flash of pain as one drew blood across my scalp, but it was a trifling wound easily ignored, and just as well, as I had no attention to spare. A dozen and more of the constructs came at me from all sides, their hands oozing into blades of rock. At first they could not so much as touch me. I swept between them in a dance of feet and wings, sometimes stepping, sometimes turning, sometimes rising high above. Every swing or lunge they made caught only empty air, or gouged the tree trunks, while almost every sweep of my glaive obliterated another foe. I could not take the time to look around me, and even if I could, the forest blocked my view, yet it seemed from the splintering sounds and battle cries that my brethren were doing as well as I. But there were so many, and they were more cunning than we credited. Our flight ceased to be an advantage as they started coming at us from the treetops. Apparently their legs were just as malleable as their hands, making climbing as simple for them as walking. They brought several of us down in those first moments, diving upon us from above, crushing with their great weight, or stabbing with their jagged limbs. Whether by skill or fortune, I was not among the first to fall. I heard the rustling of the branches, saw a movement just before the creature leapt. I kicked out with both legs, and though it felt as though my feet might break, I succeeded in knocking it back. It struck the tree from which it had just emerged and began to fall, but I had already dived below, glaive upraised. It tumbled past me in two distinct halves, crumbling to smaller pieces well before it struck the earth. I was even able to nudge one such piece aside so that it landed on one of its fellow constructs, distracting it sufficiently for me to finish it off. We were destroying them, but not swiftly enough. A small mass of them came at me from behind, and I turned my glaive, not on them, but on a nearby bole. The great tree tumbled, crushing many of the enemy and granting me a moment to recover. And still there were more. The Faneguard would be overrun. Or so I feared, for a moment, before salvation appeared above, silhouetted against the burning sun. I told you before that each of us had our assigned duties for almost any contingency. What I had not known, what most of us had not known, was that should an enemy of overwhelming numbers appear, one of us had been assigned to return instantly to the White City in search of aid. I understand why we were not told. Some would have found it demoralizing to contemplate. Some would have thought it a slight to our pride. When had the Faneguard ever required outside assistance? Yet now I see the wisdom. From above, a second phalanx plummeted into the fray, and at their head was not just any captain, any general, but great Abaddon himself. Have you ever looked upon Abaddon? Have you ever seen him in battle? He is a force beyond reckoning, beyond comprehension. His wings are iron as much as muscle, and sinew and feather. His impossible sword, longer than he is tall, he wields as though it were a toy. Taller and broader of shoulder than any of us, his golden armor and ivory white tabard gleaming more brightly than the sun behind him, he waded into the foe. It appeared that his blade, which he swung so rapidly it seemed to form a solid arch, needed only get near one of the constructs to blast the creature to dust. He refused to acknowledge the presence of the trees, but swung his sword as he needed. If it encountered a trunk on its way to the target, well, it simply swept through without slowing. And somehow, no matter what the direction from which he struck, those trees always fell to hinder the constructs, never even a single angel. Between Abaddon's ferocity and our newly inflated numbers, we rapidly turned the tide. Only a handful more angels fell to the constructs, while we destroyed them by the hundreds. The woods were filled with the crash of shattering stone, punctuated by sporadic bursts as the cannoneers found an open target. But even as the seemingly endless horde finally began to taper off, Something else appeared in their place. The enemy had reinforcements as well. These, too, were constructs, but entirely unlike the initial wave. The stone that made up their narrow bodies was all but hidden beneath angled plates and long limbs of brass. They looked rather the way heaven's champions might be depicted in the stained glass windows of the White City's grandest chapels. Sharp, angular, jointed in abnormal places. They did not walk at all, but rather sat upon a narrow brass spindle that spun rapidly from the waist downward, without ever jostling their upper halves. They boasted 4 long arms. Like their stone forerunners, they had no heads, and their hands seemed capable of forming whatever implements they might require. Do I even need to tell you that most of them had chosen to form massive, razor-edged blades? They were horrifically fast, these new constructs, and the whine of their spinning shafts was the only warning of their approach. You would think that the underbrush would impede them, but they sped along without any obvious difficulty. And they could leap, as many of us learned in our final moments, high enough to bring down even a soaring angel. We soaked in a monsoon of blood and feathers, limbs both flesh and metal crashed to the dirt. Still, we outnumbered them. They were not much faster than we. And most important, we still had Abaddon. Even with their astounding speed, few could lay a blade on him, and those that did invariably failed to penetrate his armor. His massive sword rose and fell, almost without effort, and the animated warriors died. Through upraised blades and their brass shells, he cut them down, each with a single blow. We were rallying behind Abaddon when one particular construct appeared, subtly different from the others. Not in build, not in attitude, but in armament. Rather than form its own hands into blades, it carried a peculiar sword, the likes of which I'd never seen before. Something about the weapon disturbed even warriors such as ourselves, and I recall falling back a step as it advanced on our commander. Abaddon raised his own sword, moving to meet this new threat. Okay, it's not the most obvious thing in the world, but that is where Chapter 2 ends. Right in the middle of a sentence, and it cuts off the next word with one of those double-length hyphens I can never remember the name of. This is interesting. If I might add a thought here, I think this might be one of those things they later changed in the lore. If I seem to remember that Darksiders 3 sort of established that unlike humans, immortals like angels and demons, well, when they die, they don't, go to their eternal rest. They just respawn, essentially. You have to do some very creative stuff to perma-kill an angel or a demon, which is kind of why their war has gone on for, well, literally since the dawn of time. We'll see what is about to befall Death next time on Let's Read Darksiders the Abomination Vault. I'm BurningDogFace, and I hope you'll join me for that. Later!